Recently on my Twitch, I played a historic speed game of Civilization 6. Now you may wonder, what exactly historic speed means, as it's not an option like standard or marathon. Well, in execution, it is a combination of both. Historic speed options typically use standard production speed times, while using extended research times. I loved this in Civ 5, where popular mods slowed the game down to allow for proper wars in each era, to really take your time and experience the true feel of civilization. Civ 6 takes a similar approach and manner. I specifically used the Take Your Time Ultimate Edition mod, with settings of 2.5 times longer and extreme era scaling for both science and culture research trees. Over the course of the game, I noticed many differences in the setup and pacing, as well as small mechanic changes throughout the game that really gave a different experience from base game Civ 6. This video will seek to analyze historic speed and apply the ideas of it to the greater context of Civilization 6's pacing. Adding to this, I hope to convince you all that historic speed is the definitive way to play Civilization 6. I want to preface this essay by saying that I am still generally new to Civilization 6. Now to some that may sound weird as I have 400 hours in the game, but any veteran Civ player knows this is next to nothing. This video is merely a collection of my ideas and thoughts around Civilization 6's pacing. While some who have more experience or are in the pro scene of Civilization 6 may disagree, this is just my thoughts from my hours in playtime. Something I've always felt in Civ is that the early game is both drawn out and rushed. Often half the game is the lead up to education, when science can finally boom, the rest of the game just flies by to the atomic era. But at the same time, there's never enough production for everything. Often this means that war is not a real option in the early game, unless the warmonger is already ahead in tech, or can take enough to quickly catch back up. For me, historic speed fixes this. How does making the game take longer fix the issue of the game feeling too long? Quite simply, it matches production effectively to science output. While in many cases buildings can still take as long or longer to build than a tech takes to research, there's enough time to fully develop a city within an era. No longer do you have to specialize and focus, but you can instead take the time to really explore the game. Having things like the option for an early game war allows you to completely rethink how civilization is structured, especially on high difficulties or even against higher skill players. It really lets you take the time to explore every little complexity of Civilization 6. The game becomes something where it's not just turtling to the industrial era, then going and focusing on your goals. It's about always taking the chance to expand, explore, and change up the way a civilization is playing. This is all thanks to the ability that the slowed research times allows you to really develop and expand out your civilization. While I feel the early game is perfected with historic speed for Civilization 6, the mid-game is where I started to find the issues. Particularly, I think the issues I have fall on my choice of extreme era scaling, but there's a few other issues that are very unique to Civilization 6 over other Civilization games. One particular issue is throughout the Renaissance and Industrial era, a lack of buildings. Less than half the techs have a building associated with them, compared to about 2/3 of the techs in the early game. Furthermore, from the medieval era on, there's no new districts up until the second half of the Industrial era. This leads to developed cities hitting a point of stagnation in development. Now while this makes perfect for having war, it causes the mid-game for many to be endlessly plagued by building city projects and slowly colonizing wherever new resources happen to be. The other issue is with these resources. While neither has its own shortages, the real issue is coal. The need to be powered while having all ships and several units needing it first is an issue, and then oil later on makes it nearly impossible to have a standing army while maintaining power and lower carbon outputs. Oil is needed for nearly everything, and especially on my map, it was nowhere to be found. A normal game, this hits far less, as it tends to be fewer units, and everything can be used more strategically. It's only a short period of time, but when we're talking the span of 100 or so turns, you really start to notice how necessary oil is for your civilization. While this makes sense, especially looking historically to the use of oil, it makes the game a lot harder to play. You have to focus a lot more on it. This is very unique to Civilization 6, as it's the only one to have these per turn resource use, and other factors like that, which make resources so much more important. In the end, my mid-game became focused on developing cities to a point where they could just spam out science projects to try and speed past the oil era. Although I was at no real luck here, I did manage to develop some bits of my civilization and expand a little bit. My only wish was that less things required oil and coal, so I could actually focus on expanding out my empire and focusing more on those wars. I get that strategic resources are to balance out strategic value of troops and land, but maybe especially for a historic speed game, the values could be tweaked for better use. The final section of the game I want to talk about is from the modern era to the endgame. This is where oil really becomes a problem, and where I really started to stagnate in what I could be building. Originally, at this point, I was considering going for either a military victory or a science victory, and I was always planning to conquer a few civs at least on the way. A few things changed this. First, that lack of oil. Without oil, I could not keep my troops up, and I could not really expand. As I expanded into Scotland, the one empire I managed to take out, I noticed that the oil shortages were making it so I could produce basically no new troops that would have effective combat strengths against the enemy troops. The second thing that changed my mind was taking a look at the diplomacy screen. Overall, I would not recommend having diplomatic victories on because it just takes away so much of your potential game time. At this point, mid-industrial era, there are already multiple civs halfway to the diplomatic victory. I realized I was going to have to switch up my plans and focus on this, because a diplomatic victory was bound to happen at this rate far beyond the informational era, and nowhere near this future era where I could actually get a science victory. While this is really an issue of the mod, it's more on the way I think diplomatic victory works. My belief here is that when you're against AI, it's all about the luck of voting with them and then just spamming your economy onto their disaster relief projects. There'll be so many of these that the fact that I managed to get it in the atomic era was really late compared to if I had focused on it. If I had really wanted to, I could have probably won a diplomatic victory back in the industrial era. It really talks about how when you extend out these game times, without extending the distance between the World Congress sessions, you can't really just ignore the diplomatic victory. The requirement being only 20 points makes it rather quick to claim. And since I managed to pull it off halfway through the atomic era while only focusing on it for a short while, you can see why it's not really useful to the great idea of a historic speed civ game. Now I have my own criticisms of the diplomatic victory, but I'll probably save those for a later video. All in all, the real key idea of this is, if you're going to be doing a historic speed game, that modern era to late game really becomes the issue of resources, which I feel accurately mimics the real world, but does take away from the enjoyment of the gameplay. Apart from that, it's about being able to focus on keeping at pace and not losing to a religious or diplomatic victory, which might just suddenly come out of nowhere. When I started this project, it was because I found Civ 6 zoomed by way too quickly. I'd always reach the late game before even completing every district type in my cities, and in other games I didn't have an encampment until I needed it for a late game war. Longer game speeds didn't fix this because everything scaled the same. My production was still way behind my science, right up until the late game. I used historic options to lengthen the game in a way that actually affected how it played out, by shifting the imbalance between production and science and culture. Overall, while I had my criticisms, I would say that some refining of my personal settings, this becomes the definitive way to play Civilization in single player. By its shortcomings in many areas, it gives you a chance to fully explore every bit of history created through a game of Civ. Begin to notice the small details more, and become more invested in your civilization. Above all else, you can experience every phase of warfare and development. When you march an army across the map, it will no longer be centuries outdated by the time it arrives. Cities have time to expand into flourishing medieval centers, properly rise and fall across the ages as wars continue on. Historic speed does as it says. It makes Civ feel historic. Every moment builds with others over time to create a grander picture. Instead of having a set playstyle, it lets you grow and learn, testing out different ways to play Civ while still being able to long-term keep yourself in the game. Civ 6 without the mod is good, but it can fall into a set way of going as it breezes by. However, it can be better. Getting to see a civilization grow long-term provides a new light on the game. I highly recommend adding this mod to your single-player experience to try the true scale of Civilization. The historic speed mod gives light to Civ in a way that no other way of playing can. Makes Civ a truly historic game, and is the definitive way to play it.